Dear learners, welcome to another video on testing of null hypothesis. What do you know about hypothesis? Yes, hypotheses are tentative generalizations about the result of a study. It is also known as studied guess about the result. We have seen in a previous video that null hypotheses are used to test the hypothesis. Whenever a researcher forms a hypothesis, the condition is that the hypothesis should be measured and tested. In that context, let's see null hypothesis and its testing system. How do we test the null hypothesis? What are the processes we have to test the null hypothesis? These are the concerns of today's discussions. Definitely, there are certain concerns we have. The stages of hypothesis testing, how to interpret the result, how to wisely mention the p-values, whether reject null hypothesis, fail to reject null hypothesis, what are the context and conditions to decide upon. All these are the factors of today's concerns and discussions. What is a null hypothesis? Null hypothesis states that there is no relationship between or among variables. There is no difference between or among different groups on a specific variable. Otherwise, we call it as absence of relationship, absence of difference between two groups on a variable. This is actually stated as null hypothesis. As I told you earlier, this is a testing hypothesis. But I can tell you, null hypotheses are devices to test the hypothesis. I hope that you got a clarity regarding hypothesis and null hypothesis. We know that hypothesis mentioned as H0, H underscore 0, this is normally the way to denote null hypothesis. When we compare means, how do we write null hypothesis? Exactly, it is mean 1 is equal to mean 2. That means there is no difference between the mean scores of first group and second group. The other is when we talk about relationship, there is no relationship between x and y. The relationship is not significant. That is actually the null hypothesis. If it exists, it is by mere chance. That is actually through null hypothesis we state. Null hypothesis, let me read whatever is written in the slide. Null hypotheses are tested by statistical tools to determine whether it is we retained the term accepted as such we never use when we write the null hypothesis. When I talk about null hypothesis, I can mention that accept. At the same time, when I write and read something about null hypothesis, I can mention accept. But at the same time, when we clearly justify and interpret based on a statistical testing, we don't use accept. We mention reject or failed to reject. Okay. The concern is that we are checking through specific statistical calculations. We have two kinds of hypotheses when we discuss null hypothesis. The main focus of today, that is null hypothesis. The other version, that is alternate hypothesis. Alternate hypothesis can be of two kinds, as we have discussed in the previous lecture as well. There are two kinds of hypothesis, two possibilities. We have directional hypothesis, that is there is a significant difference between A and B with positive impact. There is a positive significant difference between X and Y. That is directional hypothesis. There is a negative association between human beings, gender, and their relationship with. There is a negative association between human gender and their preferences in marriages. These are directional hypotheses. When we talk about non-directional hypothesis, by name itself, the direction will not be clear. There is a difference between boys and girls. We don't know that who is performing better. There is a relationship between social intelligence and aggressive behavior among primary school students. As a researcher, I have not mentioned whether it is positive relationship or negative relationship. This is non-directional hypothesis. So hypothesis can be of directional and non-directional altogether. These are alternate hypothesis and the negation. There is no relationship. There is no relationship between use of AI and academic achievement. There is no difference between boys and girls in their AI use. All these are negation, that is null hypothesis. You got a clarity regarding that. What are the significance of null hypothesis? Yes, null hypotheses are very significant because it uses to prove or disprove the research hypothesis. In every research, we will have hypothesis. We mention as H1 or HA, whatever it is, H underscore A or H1, we write it. So, whenever we are writing a hypothesis, that we call it as the major hypothesis, we call it as research hypothesis. How do we write or develop research hypothesis? We have already discussed. How do we do that? Yes, we review intensively regarding the variables and their relationship, either or relationship, effects, or difference between groups regarding a variable or more than one variable. Here what we are doing is, after thorough review, we will get the result of those reviews. Based on that, we make sure that how many studies mention a directional hypothesis and the direction is which direction it is, whether it is positive relationship or it mention a negative relationship. What is the ratio of positive and negative relationship? How the number of studies that mention negligible or insignificant relationship? From these three areas of studies classified based on an intensive systematic review, you will get an idea that what is a common trend in hypothesizing these two variables in a research study. Shall I go for a directional or I go for a non-directional? The things are clear. So hypothesis proving or hypothesis disproving is through a null hypothesis. So when we have a hypothesis, we have to collect the data relevant, apply the statistics appropriately for the specific data set, find out the level of significance and fix it whether it is rejected or failed to reject. Then we decide upon. In this case, to ensure the testing of hypothesis, whatever the research hypothesis you have to write it in its alternative null form. That is, all the hypothesis you have to be mentioned it as null form when you are going to test the hypothesis. Never ever write the null hypothesis as your main hypothesis, because hypotheses are the lighting lamps for a researcher. So if you don't have a rigorous hypothesis, that means that you have not perceived or conceived the problem as such. If I say that there is no difference between boys and girls in academic performance, if this is my major hypothesis, I mentioned it's null, it is wrong actually, because if I don't have a concern about the sex category, how can I say that I can take it as a major variable? If your hypothesis itself is no relationship or no difference, then that variable itself is gone and its validity has gone forever. You cannot take that variable if you are using a null hypothesis. So my concern again is, whenever you are writing a hypothesis as your major hypothesis, write it as either directional or non-directional. When it comes to testing of the hypothesis, mention your hypothesis, research hypothesis, and give the corresponding null hypothesis. Then work on that during the testing, because the test result will be identified and judged upon null hypothesis. Consider it as a base of judging upon the feasibility of your research hypothesis. Got an idea? Yes. It gives directions to the study. It helps to control type 1 error. These are evidence based result and falsifiable. Null hypotheses are falsifiable. These are some of the very significant concerns or significance when we talk about null hypothesis. It represents status quo like a famous legal principle. We know that innocent until proven guilty. We consider a man innocent until they proven guilty. This way, we consider null hypothesis as well. You got an idea, I think. Yes. Now come to testing. How do we test the hypothesis? We know that testing the null hypothesis is the cornerstone in every statistical inferences. Whenever you are doing a statistical calculation in your study, the ultimate result depends upon whether you have used the appropriate null hypothesis testing strategies or not. Yes, it ensures the acceptance, what we call it as, whether the alternate hypothesis is sustained, it is validated or not. On the other hand, we mention through null hypothesis whether it is rejected or failed to reject. Got an idea about significance of null hypothesis? When I read between the lines of the mentioned part in the screen, see, null hypothesis testing is often referred to as null hypothesis significant testing. It is a statistical method or procedure used to determine whether there is enough evidence in a sample of data to reject the null hypothesis. He mentioned that there is no difference between male and female students in terms of their social competence. So, whether we have enough evidence in the data set that we have collected out of 300 samples, whether there is apt evidence to reject the null hypothesis. I got a relationship study which relates mental health and well-being of nurses of India. So if I work on the nursing professionals of India as as a specific country, so I have to collect data from various parts using a systematic or cluster sampling. Now I have a concern that my hypothesis is there is a relationship between mental health and well-being among nursing professionals of India. This is my hypothesis. To test the hypothesis, I converted into null form, that is, there is no relationship between mental health and well-being among nursing professionals of India. Now, if I collect the data from 1200 sample across India, from the northeast, some of samples I've collected, east, west, south, north, and middle part of India I've collected, and from this 1200 samples, whether I have ample evidence to reject the null hypothesis or not. If I get a strong correlation and it is significant, I can tell you that, I can tell the audience of my research is that my null hypothesis is rejected. That is, there is a significant difference between mental health and well-being among nursing professionals of India. This is the way of testing of hypothesis. You got an idea now. The goal of hypothesis testing is to assess whether the observed data is sufficiently unlikely under the null hypothesis, suggesting that the null hypothesis may not hold true. The process relies on probability and statistical significance to make inferences about population based on sample data. These are all the things that we have to look into very significantly. So you got an idea now. We have discussed what is a null hypothesis, how it is related to the research hypothesis, why we design and develop a null hypothesis, and now comes to assumptions of null hypothesis. What are the assumptions of null hypothesis? The null hypothesis is assumed to be true unless evidence suggests otherwise. Second assumption is any observed effect or difference in the sample is due to random chance unless proven otherwise. The third assumption about null hypothesis is the test does not prove the null or alternate hypothesis, but it provides evidence to reject or fail to reject. Got an idea about it? Yes. These are the assumptions about null hypothesis. Now see, the testing of hypothesis as a system, what are the stages involved in it? Steps in testing null hypothesis. You have to state the hypothesis. State the whatever the hypothesis you have, you are stating. For example, there is a difference between boys and girls in their emotional maturity. So I am writing boys are not equal to girls in their emotional maturity. I just mentioned AM. This is my alternate hypothesis. Boys are not equal to girls. That is, there is a difference between boys and girls in their emotional maturity. Now I have to decide when I do some statistical calculation, which level of significance I mention. Generally, in some of the statistical software like SPSS, Jamovi, we go for 95% of the confidence limit, that is 0.05 level of confidence. So I have already mentioned in the previous discussions of this course only that there are two prevalent levels we use in social sciences, education and humanities, that is 95% of the confidence limit and sometimes 99% of the confidence limit. Otherwise, we will mention as 0.01 level and 0.05 level of significance. So once hypothesis there, you just mention the level of significance. Decide the level of significance. The third thing is that select an appropriate statistical test. Select an appropriate statistical test. What is the statistical test for comparing boys and girls? Suppose if it is a large sample, sampling is properly done using any probability sampling methods. If the sample number is high, the normality is ensured, we can go for independent sample t-test. These are the levels. Here I have mentioned the alternate hypothesis. What is this null hypothesis? I forgot to mention that is boys means is equal to girls mean. This is null hypothesis. Alternate and null hypothesis we have written, mention the level, we have chosen the appropriate test, that is independent sample t-test. Independent sample t-test we are selecting. Got an idea? Now collect the data and compute the test statistics. So what you have to do is, once you decide everything, now with the appropriate tool on emotional maturity, collect the data from the sample, because you have mentioned that it is independent sample data. Large sample is required, sampling should be random, and then you decide how to go ahead with the collection of the data. So what is required for the data collection? Appropriate tool, or we call it as measure. Appropriate tool or measure you should have. What do you mean by measure? Measure is a term generally we use in international journals reputed and published in the Scopus and Web of Sciences, not tools. Mostly they mention measures. So these are both and one and same. Both are one and same, right? So the tool selection is also a matter. Your tool should give you a data that is significant, and also the data should be validated. The tool should be validated and should get an independent score. That is, the scaling should be either interval or ratio. The scaling should be either interval scale or ratio scale when you go for a tool. That is also concerned, then only we can go for independent sample t-test. Why? What is the concern? Yes, it is a parametric test. Independent sample t-test is a parametric test. For a parametric test, the data collected should be, the variable should be observed either in interval or ratio scaling. Got an idea? Yes. Now determine the p-value. Determine the p-value. What is the satisfied level? We have already mentioned the value, that is 95% confidence limit and 99% of the confidence limit. Here we find out the statistical value for that specific test. And again, based on that, you just make a decision whether it is the null hypothesis rejected or failed to reject. This is the case. Then we are interpreting result. For example, you got a t value of 2.58. 2.58 value is more than fixed value for a 0.01 level. So I can say that the result is significant. The test is significant. So what will be my decision? The null hypothesis rejected, since the obtained t value is 2.58 and it is above the fixed value for 0.01 level, that is 2.58 for the larger sample. So the decision is that in this case the null hypothesis is rejected. Once null hypothesis is rejected, what is the interpretation? Yes, there is a significant difference between boys and girls in their emotional intelligence or emotional maturity. This is the overall way of testing the null hypothesis. So step one by one, again I explain through the PPT. See, state the null and alternate hypothesis. First you write your hypothesis, whatever it is, that is original hypothesis. Then you make a null form as well. Okay. Next is what kind of level you can use it. Whether it is hypothesis testing, you use a one-tail test or two-tail test. Where we use one-tail test? For example, if I say that the strategy I developed, for example, I designed a strategy. This is a strategy I designed to ensure mental health of kids. I used a strategy. That strategy consists of lots of play activities. So through the play activities, when I write it, I am sure, if I am sure that this is effective, I can tell you my test of statistics will be one-tailed, because I say that after my experimentation, students' mental health will increase drastically. I am confident about it. So I am writing the directional hypothesis. When I directional hypothesis, my major hypothesis, I have to go for one-tail test of significance always. If I don't know exactly about it, it's a problem happened, it's a research I've conducted, collected data, I don't know much about the situation, I got this data. In that case, you can go for a two-tailed test, because your hypothesis will also be like that. You are not sure about the positive relationship, neither about positive relationship nor about the negative relationship. Confused, perplexed. So you can also go for a non-directional hypothesis. If non-directional hypothesis there, definitely we have to go for a two-tailed test of statistical analysis for its significance. Right. Now, next is, I told you, when you fix a variable and identify the data and collect now the choose of a significant level, whether 0.5 or 0.05, 0.01. This is actually by the team of researchers in consultation with the research group. Sometimes if you are in a department, university department, they may have certain policy to fix a level, maybe otherwise journalists will have their own policy. Otherwise you can also make a consensus among the team of members in your department or college, and then you can look into that and do some serious task. So this is 0.1 and 0.5, right? Now the statistical calculation, here also it requires rigorous effort from the part of the organizer. Select the appropriate statistics is another step. Here also there should be a significant contribution from the part of the researcher, because researcher should have a statistical reasoning. When I use the statistics, for what purpose? How can I justify the use of this statistic for testing of this hypothesis? That kind of statistical reasoning is essential for testing a statistics. So t-test, generally t-test, when you look into the t-test, we have different types of t-test. I have just mentioned compares means between two groups. We have independent sample t-test. If you have two independent groups, for example, boys and girls will have to be compared based on their common property language proficiency. So both the language proficiency of boys and girls will be tested, and we will go for a independent sample t-test for comparing and related null hypothesis testing. If it is a paired sample t-test, for example, I experimented a strategy in my class where the students will be happy, in a happy state of affairs after I started implementing my specific pedagogic strategy. So initially, I have to take a test of happiness, whether they are happy with my class, perceived happiness of students. Again, the moment of happiness curriculum, or a framework or strategy what I have developed, I'm just giving to the people, students. Now again, after the 1 month of intervention or 2 months of intervention, again I check their happiness score through the same pretest scale or pretest test. Whatever the test or scale or questionnaire, whatever you have, the same thing you are using again. Now you got whether this is properly executed or not. If it is a significant difference, we say that the idea that I proposed is very effective to engage the secondary school students. So this is a, then when we have more than two groups, we will go for one-way ANOVA. When we are going for a correlation, relationship, we go for a product moment correlation. Parametric version is Kendall-Stowe and ranked correlation. Chi-square test is simply for identifying the association between things. For example, there are different colors of car. The color of choice of the color is by choice or by chance. This is a then accordingly the marketing companies can vary the price of the specific piece of car in terms of color. Even refrigerators is also having such kind of differences. So the concern of discussion is that when you are going to correlate, product moment correlation is okay if it is a large sample, normality is ensured, both the variables are measured in either interval or ratio. These are the conditions. Chi-square is another thing. Chi-square is an association. For example, if you're talking about color of car and the sales, so people look into the car based on the color. So you have got a number of sales data, and you can analyze the data based on the chi-square whether exactly the color is by chance or by choice. If it is by choice, it is a significant chi-square. The companies will increase the price of certain colors if it is in high demand. Similarly, the refrigerators, design of the laptops, these are all some of the things generally we do and use the chi-square for testing their significant choices. So correlation we have already mentioned. Chi-square is for association. Especially for the chi-square, data should be nominal. Frequencies are required for doing the analysis with chi-square test. Correlation test we have already mentioned. Pearson's for product moment correlation sometimes, or we mention Kendall-Stowe or rank correlation of Spearman. Whatever is the regression analysis for further prediction calculation, predictability, making the prediction equation, cause-effect relationship, cause-effect relationship. For all these, we use regression analysis as well. So, which one is appropriate as per your hypothesis? That you have to decide. As a researcher, you should have a minimum reasoning to identify which test is appropriate for you. These are all about ANOVA. So here concern is that which statistics, whether the assumptions of the statistics have to be fulfilled. Second is which type of data you have. I already mentioned continuous, that is interval or ratio, continuous. It depends upon the types of data, whether it is continuous, that is ratio or interval, categorical, that is nominal, ordinal. These are the rank based. These are the categorical data. Distribution of data, whether it is normal or non-normal, whether it is lying in the normal curve or not. Again, the study design, sometimes it is paired sample, independent sample, repeated measures. All these things we have to look into while deciding the appropriate statistics, right? Now the collection of data. Once you are very clear about it, just collect the data according to the appropriate measures or tool. For that, very specific ethical considerations you have to follow. Make the data set, whatever we call it as scales tool, and go to the field and instruct the researchers supporting you to collect the data. What is the way of collecting data, approaching the people, what are the things to be done, taken care of, ethical consideration. Then you are collecting the data accordingly. Then you are going for determining the values, whether it is 0.05, whether it is 0.01. That is, determine which level you are going to take it in data analysis. Now make a decision. whether my null hypothesis is rejected or failed to reject. If a p-value is equal to or greater than a specific number, we mentioned that the null hypothesis will be rejected. If it is p-value is above the table values or above a fixed value, the null hypothesis will be failed to reject. These are some of the things that we have to have a clarity, right? Now interpret the result. Once null hypothesis rejected, that means there is a significant relationship between x and y. There is a significant difference between x and y. If the null hypothesis failed to reject, you can say that the interpretation is there is no significant difference between x and y. There is no significant relationship between among x, y and z. This will be the interpretation of the testing of hypothesis. Now, there is one more thing. There is a chance of certain issues during hypothesis testing, that is type 1 and type 2 error. Just with this, I will conclude that what is type 1 error? Type 1 error is rejecting, it occurs when it is false positive. That is rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true. The probability of this error is known as alpha error. That is rejecting null hypothesis when it is true. Type 2 error is failing to reject null hypothesis when it is false. Failing to reject null hypothesis when it is false, we generally have to reject it. But failing to reject is leading to type 2 error. It is denoted as beta error. Then power of a test. What is the power of a test? Is actually 1 minus beta is the probability of correctly rejecting false null hypothesis. Power increases with large sample size, large effect size and lower alpha error. These are the concerns of discussion for today. How was the discussion? It was a rigorous session on hypothesis testing. This is a very significant testing that we need, very significant concern that we have to have. I hope that you've enjoyed the video. Now see what is the level of your achievement. Can you say that you can able to explain about testing of hypothesis? Yeah, tell me what are the stages? Yes. Writing the hypothesis, that is research hypothesis, either directional or non-directional. Corresponding null hypothesis, write it. Identify the level of significance. Yes. Next is identify the appropriate statistics. Go and collect the data with the proper measures or tools, systematically using appropriate sampling. Now, come with your data and judge upon whether the data is okay or not. Apply the appropriate statistics using the statistical reasoning. Next is judge whether it is okay or not based on the null hypothesis, whether it is rejected or failed to reject, you have to mention. Now interpret based on that. This is the significant concern on testing of hypothesis. Hope you've enjoyed. Write it in a notebook. Very specifically read. Definitely it will be beneficial for you in further research journey. I hope that you are doing research in your FIUG either or in your post-graduation or master's program. I wish you all the success. Thank you so much.